Hi and welcome to another tutorial video. In this tutorial video what I'm going to be doing is introducing the concept of object-oriented programming in a language agnostic way. So this tutorial should be useful no matter what programming language you're using to practice object-oriented programming. And in this series of video tutorials, what I'll be doing is going over the key concepts of object-oriented programming and sort of demystifying the terms associated with it and explaining exactly what they mean. Okay, so let's begin. So in object-oriented programming, our aim is to write programs in a way that's broadly similar to the real world as much as possible. And the point of object-oriented programming is to provide a mechanism for the programmer to express ideas more clearly. So if you've begun studying object-oriented programming, you've probably come across the idea of a class. And this is one of the first terms that comes up when you start looking into object-oriented programming. And in object-oriented programming, classes are used to encapsulate information about a concept and functionality that is associated with that concept. So a class is used to store information about a concept and functionality associated with that concept. And a nice analogy that you can use, and do remember that it is an analogy, is that a class is a bit like a blueprint for an object. So an object can be thought of as a particular instance of what is described by a class. When a house is being built, there are plans for the house, and many similar houses might be built and from the same plan. And the class is a bit like the plan, and then the individual houses are a bit like the objects in object-oriented programming. They're the individual instances of what is described by the plan. So an example of this in an actual program is that we might create a customer class, which, when instantiated, and we'll come on to this word again in more detail in a second, instantiated just means the act of taking the plan and creating the object. When instantiated, stores information about a particular customer of a business and contains functionalities or actions that the customer that might be taken on the customer. So we've got our example that I'll be using the house example once more in a bit, and I'll be using the customer class example throughout this video. So we could have a customer class that stores information and actions associated with a customer of a business, like for example a supermarket. So the next term you might come across when studying object-oriented programming is the idea of a field or an attribute. So it's sometimes called a field, sometimes called an attribute. And again, the way this is implemented in various programming languages is always slightly different, but the idea is the same. And a field of a class stores a particular piece of information about the concept that we're describing with our class. Okay, so each field stores some information about the concept we're describing with our class. So if we take the example of the customer class, there are a variety of different fields that you could have that you could create for a customer class. So here are some examples. So we could have customer since, so we could have a field storing the date that they became a customer of the business. So supermarkets, for example, often have a loyalty point scheme, so you could have a field storing how many loyalty points the customer has. And you could have a field storing when the customer last visited the store. So if they haven't visited the store in a long time, you might want to send them a good offer to try and entice them back to visiting the store again. So that's what a field is. So a field stores some information about the concept we're describing with our class, and the example that I have is the customer class. So the customer is the concept that we're describing with the class, and we can store information about a customer, for example the time since the date that they became a customer, the number of loyalty points they've got, and when they last visited the store. Some examples. Okay, so let's move on to looking at methods. As you'll remember from just a bit earlier in the tutorial, I mentioned that a class can also describe functionalities associated with the concept that our class is describing, and this is what methods are for. So we use methods in the class to describe the behaviour of a class, and methods are a bit like functions that you'll have been using in procedural programming if you've done some basic programming before now, except that they can't be called anywhere. They must be called on an object, which is an instantiation of a class that the method lives in. And there are some exceptions to that, but I'll come on to that in more advanced tutorials. So methods describe the behaviour of a class, and they're a bit like functions, but they're declared inside of a class, and they can't be called anywhere like a function can in a procedural or imperative program. So what are some examples of methods that we could have for our customer class? So one method that we could have is modify last visited store, and what that might do is take a date as a parameter, and set that as the new value of last visited store. So it will just update the date when the customer last visited the store. We might have a similar method for the loyalty points field. So we might have multiply loyalty points. It could take a parameter and then add that number of loyalty points onto the number of loyalty points that the customer has. We might also have a method like get last visited store, and that might return the date that the customer last visited the store. So if you are writing a bit of programming code which checked when the customer last visited the store to decide whether they should be sent an offer, that method could be used to find out when they last visited the store. You could also have a similar one for loyalty points. So if you wanted to, for example, print a customer receipt, and you wanted to put on the receipt how many loyalty points that customer currently has, then you could use get loyalty points to find out how many loyalty points they have. Okay, so that's just a quick example, a quick overview of what methods are then. So methods describe the behaviour of a class. There is also a special type of method that you'll need to be aware of when you start doing object-oriented programming, and that's called a constructor. What a constructor does is it is the method that is called when the class is instantiated. So if you go back to our house class example, the constructor is a bit like the plan that the builders would follow to build the house that the blueprint describes. So the constructor is all of the things that are done, so the list of programming statements that are done when an object is created from the class, which is our plan for what the object should be like. So a constructor is used to create an instance of a class. And that's all that you really need to know about a constructor, and what I'm going to be doing now is going through an example of what a class might look like in pseudocode, so that you can see how a constructor would be used. Okay, so I've written here an example of what a customer class might look like in a sort of pseudocode. So this isn't written in any particular language, I've just written it in a sort of pseudocode so that it's language agnostic. And you can see I've declared my class called customer, and these are my fields here that I've put in the class for now. So I've got the last visited store field, which is a date, and the loyalty points field, which is an integer. And this method here is the constructor. So this is the constructor, and what this constructor basically is doing in this example is that it doesn't take any arguments, And what it does is it sets last visited store equal to get current date. So I've imagined that there's some method that we can call to get the current date. And the reason I'm doing this is because my idea is that when we create a customer, they're a new customer that has just visited the store, so that their last visit to the store is the current date. And I'm going to set their loyalty points to 0 because they're a new customer, so they haven't got any loyalty points yet. So that's typically what a constructor will do. There are some. There might also be some other things that the constructor does. So a constructor doesn't just have to set the value of fields; it can do other things as well. And then these two methods here are not special methods like the constructor is. Every class has to have a constructor, but these methods here, you can have any number in a class. It doesn't matter how many methods you have. And this one here, modify last visited store, takes a parameter last visit, and which is a date, and sets last visited store to that date. So if the customer is just visiting the store, the system can update the time they last visited the store to a new date. Then finally I've got a method down here that says get last visited store, which if for example the system is trying to decide whether to send the customer an offer via email or something if they haven't visited the store in a long time, it could call this method get last visited store, and this method would return the value of this field here, last visited store, to whatever part of the program called the method. Okay, so that's just an example, a language agnostic example of a class. So the key things to take from this are that we've got fields that can store data about the concept that we're describing with our class. We've also got a constructor, which is a special type of method that every class has to have, which will create a new instance of a class. So it's called when the class is instantiated. And instantiation is the process of creating a new instance of a class. And methods are declared down here in this example, and they describe the behavior of a class. So they provide functionality which is associated with the data that we're storing in our class. So they describe the behavior of the concept that we're describing with the class. And just to note down here that I've only included these two methods for simplicity, but as I said a little while ago, you could have as many methods as you want to manipulate as many fields as you want in the class. Okay, so I hope you found this tutorial video useful on the basic terminology associated with classes and object-oriented programming, and thanks for watching.